Jen has ordered a decadent seafood tower, king crab legs, lobster tails, and a waterfall of caviar. Pricey? You bet. But Jen worked with Empower on her savings and investment strategy and planned for splurges like these. She got good at money, so she can be a little bad. Ooh, champagne. Empower. Invest well, live a little. Start today at empower.com.
Past performance is not indicative of future returns. Investing involves risk. You may lose money. Advisory services are provided for a fee by Empower Advisory Group, LLC, EAG, a registered investment advisor with the Securities and Exchange Commission. OMG, those shrimps are really jumbo.
After just 7 days, 96% of Shiseido Benefiance Wrinkle Smoothing Eye Cream users saw reduced wrinkles and diminished dark circles. Shop now at Sephora and discover how change can happen in the blink of an eye. Consumer tested by 110 women.
Learning through play starts with Lego Duplo. With Lego Duplo, toddlers can develop real-life skills while having fun with colorful bricks made just for them. Large, easy to grip, and safe to explore. When children express themselves with Lego Duplo, they build patience, problem-solving, and empathy. See your child learn perseverance and self-expression with everything they imagine and create. Visit lego.com/preschool to learn more.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
I'm Chris Holmes, and this is Burned by Books. Here you'll find interviews with writers you already love, like Jennifer Egan and Rebecca Mackay, mixed in with up-and-coming voices like Alexandra Kleeman and Rumaan Alam. You'll find us wherever you listen to podcasts, but check out previous episodes at burnedbybooks.com and on Instagram and Twitter at burnedbybooks. Let's start the show. In his latest novel, The Imagined Life, Andrew Porter gives us a detective story of sorts, though without the detective, and where the crime is vague and perhaps unsolvable. Stephen Mill's life is falling apart. Separated from his wife and son, he can't help but think that he has inherited a familial disorder, something passed down from his father, whose mental illness and career unraveling colors Stephen's childhood remembrances and haunt him as an adult. And thus, he sets out to reconstitute what happened to his father the year that he was denied tenure, tracking down and speaking with former colleagues, friends, and rivals to help put together a picture of what exactly happened to his family. Told as a series of flashbacks to the early 1980s, The Imagined Life gives us a middle schooler's perspective on the dissolution of family life in the wake of mental illness, marital betrayal, and the unsettling of a stable existence in the world for a child and for an adult. Written with an enormous well of empathy and in a perfected, beautiful prose style, Andrew Porter's The Imagined Life is one of the great contemporary novels of family life, of 1980s Californian culture, and of a photographic still of an academic world that is all but lost. Andrew Porter is the author of the short story collections The Disappeared and The Theory of Light and Matter, and a previous novel, In Between Days. A graduate of the Iowa Writers' Workshop, he has received a Pushcart Prize, a James Michener Copernicus Fellowship, and the Flannery O'Connor Award for Short Fiction. His work has appeared in One Story, Plowshares, American Short Fiction, Narrative, and elsewhere. He currently teaches fiction writing and directs the creative writing program at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas. Welcome back to Burned by Books, Andrew Porter.
Thank you so much for having me, Chris. It's always a delight to talk to you.
I was so excited when I heard that this book was coming out and when I learned a little bit about what its subject matter would be, because when we last spoke, I was really obsessed with a story from The Disappeared, in which a psychology professor has been denied tenure and a shadow looms over whether a friend of his was the deciding vote against him. It was one of my favorites in that incredible collection, and I want to encourage my listeners to listen to our interview about that collection of stories because it's one of my favorite. But I was pleased to see you return to that broader topic in The Imagined Life. As with the story, tenure is both a focal crisis of the narrative, but also a stand-in for many unsaid things, disappointments and disaffections that haunt Stephen's father's life. Why is tenure such a powerful and interesting metaphor for you and for the storytelling that you want to do about friendships and families?
Yeah, tenure is, for academics, as you well know, like it's a source of certainly of major anxiety when you're on the tenure track, I think for everybody. And one of the reasons that, just to kind of explain to listeners who are not that familiar with the tenure process, if you're denied tenure as an academic, it's really hard to resurrect your career somewhere else. I mean, it happens.
You call it an excommunication.
It really is. I mean, that's how I've always come to understand it. It's very hard to get another tenure track job if you're denied. And so it really does feel like the end of something that for most academics they've been working towards since college and, all through grad school, their PhD, their dissertation. And so it represents kind of, the focus of their life for, probably over a decade. And so to suddenly have that taken away and be cast out into the world and have to kind of figure out what you're going to do, I think it is kind of like a death in a way, for a lot of academics. It feels that way if they're denied. Of course, everybody's fine in the end, but it feels, I think at the moment it can feel that way. And certainly for the character of Stephen's father in this novel, it feels that way. It's just devastating. And I think it's partly because there's, for a lot of academics, like this is the world in which their work is the most valued and, where they get to do exactly what they want to do, Eden in a way. And to be cast out of that Eden is really devastating. And so I wanted to explore what that would be like, for in this case, a father of a son.
Yeah, and it's Eden is such a fascinating way of thinking about this because I think there's the Eden of academia at a certain moment in time, and then there's the Eden of this Southern Californian life. And it's, the cover of your novel is perfect. I mean, it's exactly how I pictured the house and the pool. That arts and crafts style? Is that or is that right?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. It looks like maybe mid-century modern, but
Okay,
I'm
okay.
not sure. But yeah, it fit my imagining of it too completely.
Yeah, and it feels very Edenic and very much like at least from a child's perspective, this kind of constant cycle of friends and community and, a brilliant father and a dedicated mother and the sort of piercing of it. It becomes the point of this quest. And, the novel is these flashbacks to 1984 when Stephen is 12 and watching his parents throw these sort of elaborate pool parties. And it's also the year of the tenure decision. And he is trying to make sense of these wild vacillations in mood that affect his very talented and passionate professor father. And you really allow Stephen's limits as a child perspective, even when we're getting it from Stephen as a grown-up, to distance us from the events with his parents and to leave them ambiguous in the mind of adult Stephen, who's trying to investigate that history through his father's former colleagues. How did you go about balancing keeping Stephen's youth-colored glasses firmly on while needing the reader to make some adult conclusions?
Yeah, that was tricky because, the novel does switch between the perspective of the adult Stephen, who is much more self-aware and capable of kind of interpreting the events of the past, and then the young Stephen, and the 12-year-old Stephen, and I tried to remain true to that type of lens. And I thought that maybe the best way to do that would be to just have him kind of reporting, for the most part, what's happening in the adult world without casting judgment on it himself or without the adult even
Mhm.
casting judgment on it. And just leave it up to the reader to kind of, one, interpret what's going on, but two, also kind of make their own judgments. And I thought that that would feel the most true to a child's perspective and to how one experiences the world as a 12-year-old, which is there often isn't a lot of self-reflection at that age. You're just kind of moving from day to day, moment to moment, and you're processing things, but you're not necessarily thinking deeply about them. And so I wanted the narrative in the past in 1984 to feel that way.
What was exciting about, or even challenging about setting things in the 80s? And what were the touchstone cultural issues that lived in your mind as you were creating the world of the novel? Because one thing I really did like is that we only get little fragments of a kind of like political and societal 80s, but there's definitely a mood. There's a feel, there's just a way of being that does really feel like the 80s, even though you're not hammering us with like, constant Reaganisms.
Yeah, I mean, I think we see the political atmosphere of the 80s reflected mostly in what we learn about what's going on, in Stephen's father's
That's right.
and
Yeah.
the university and that world. Although I wanted very deliberately not to take the novel into that world. I didn't want this to be a campus novel. I didn't want Stephen to kind of go to campus, though I assume he had been, but I didn't want to have scenes set there. I wanted his sense of the academic world to be what he inferred from what his father's friends would say,
Mhm.
or
Mhm.
inferred from what he observed at these parties. I wanted it to be that, him to see that side of it.
Yeah, and were there other things about the settings in the setting in the 1980s that you felt like really kind of determined this story beyond the politics of Reagan era and just sort of the 80s in general as a time of kind of homophobia and a return to a sense of like gender norms. But outside of that, were there things about the 80s that kind of set the tone, even when you weren't describing them explicitly?
Yeah, I was drawing kind of on my own memories of being around Stephen's age at that time. And so, my memories of that world is in many ways it was a simpler world. It was a quieter world. Just, we didn't have devices, we didn't have the internet. And so life felt a little bit slower, at least in my memory of it. And I wanted that the past to feel that way, to have a kind of simpler element to it. And then, I was, as you said, kind of drawing on certain 80s pop culture references from time to time, but I didn't want to overdo that. I just wanted them to kind of, creep in different moments to kind of remind the reader that this is when this is taking place. And those were also kind of fun to write about, the music and watches and bands and things that really I remember being such a big deal when I was around Stephen's age.
I was like Steven in being obsessed with having a Swatch watch, if not having them be outside of our price range. But I remember them as being like such a touchstone.
Yeah, me too. I was definitely, that was coming from personal memory of begging my parents for a Swatch watch.
The other thing I begged for, which is less cool, is parachute pants, which I didn't get either.
Oh, I did too.
And as much as it's a novel of a remembrance of the 80s, it's also a novel of an idyllic, and to use your word, Edenic California existence of seemingly endless sun and good weather and being able to be outside and have community there. And in particular, these sort of pool parties that are important to Stephen's parents' and lives. And it is kind of full of nostalgia for a California that we now think of as blighted by the eternal presence of a world on fire. Was there some of that nostalgia for a California gone by for you?
Yeah, my family lives out there and I have a lot of nostalgic feelings for kind of earlier times in California. And I just have a deep love for the state and for the time that I've lived there and spent there. But yes, this is a kind of an earlier California, as you said. And I wanted it to feel really idyllic. And I wanted to I think I was using that really kind of beautiful setting as a kind of contrast to some of the darker elements of the novel. And I talk to my fiction writing students about this a lot, about how you have to balance light and dark elements in fiction, depending on what you want the feel of your work to be. And I really thought that this bright, sunny setting with lots of swimming pools and the beach and palm trees, like that would kind of balance out what was going on with the father, which was really pretty dark, some of the things he was contending with. And so that was another reason that I chose that setting.
Would you be willing to read a section, Andrew, that I think is a really nice sense of that contrast of light and dark? It's an early moment at one of these pool parties where something goes awry.
Sure. And just to give context, Stephen is in his bedroom and suddenly hears something happening outside that wakes him up, and he kind of wakes up in bed with a jolt and looks out the window. He says, I remember seeing a group of people standing around the pool, huddled there, and then one of them shouting, get him out, get him out. And then I remember hearing my mother make a sound that I had never heard her make before, a sound that seemed so guttural and deep it almost didn't seem real. And then seeing her fall to her knees just out of sight from where I was standing, and then looking left and seeing my father's colleagues, David Haviland and Edward Bindley and Joseph Allers, all looking down at the pool, and then wondering for a moment where my father was. I looked for him everywhere but couldn't find him. For a long time, in fact, I couldn't see anything at all. The crowd around the pool was so thick. But then eventually the crowd began to part, and I heard the sound of some weak laughter and some even weaker applause. Finally, I saw the sight of my father's back as he emerged from the pool, still in his boxer shorts, clearly embarrassed, dripping all over the deck, and then the sight of another man. It was the same man from earlier, the gaunt, handsome man with a scar on his chest, as he swam over to my father and helped him out. Once he was on the deck, my father leaned over and coughed violently into his hands, and then the man stood behind him and pounded on his back a few times until he finally stopped coughing. And then, for a while, everyone just kind of stood there silently, as if stunned by what had happened. After a moment, my father sat down in one of the chaise lounge chairs by the side of the pool, and my mother walked over to the projector, which was still playing Double Indemnity, and turned it off. Shortly after that, the men in the pool began to get out slowly, and I could tell that the party was over. A hush had fallen over the crowd, and it was clear that something had happened. I watched David Haviland as he came over to my father and handed him one of the beach towels from the cabana house, and then watched my mother as she turned around and headed back to the house by herself, not saying a word to anyone. Within a few minutes, everyone was standing up and getting dressed, their heads bowed down in a kind of communal acknowledgement that they had done something wrong, or that they had allowed something wrong to happen, or at least that they had allowed the party itself to get out of hand. I looked over again at my father then, and I could see that he was distressed, that he was hunched over in the posture of someone who had disgraced himself, staring down at his hand, shaking his head, avoiding eye contact with everyone around him. After a while, a few people walked over to him and patted him on the back, touched his shoulder gently, mussed his hair, and my father nodded at them shyly, though I could tell that it was difficult for him to even look at these people, that it was hard for him to even make eye contact with them. Before long, a few of the remaining guests began to pack up their bags at the edge of the pool, and a few others came over to join them. It was clear that everyone wanted to go home now, that they wanted to get as far away from this party and this situation as possible. I watched them as they made their way back toward the house in a small group, then listened as they entered the kitchen and spoke to my mother in soft voices, assuring her that no, they didn't need coffee, and that yes, they were okay to drive. It was amazing how quickly the party had ended and how suddenly everyone there had sobered up. From the edge of my parents' doorway, I could hear my mother apologizing now, telling everyone that my father must have had a little too much sangria, or that he must have made the latest batch a little strong, and then insisting that she hadn't even realized he'd been drinking earlier in the pool with the others. There was a brief moment of silence, and then a few of the younger professors began to chime in, assuring my mother that it had been a wonderful party anyway, and that in the morning nobody would even remember what had happened. One of the younger professors had even joked that this was part of what they got paid to do, to persist in the face of conflict, and a few of the other professors laughed at this, though it was clear that nobody there had found what had happened funny at all.
Thank you so much. I think that's such a brilliant moment of understanding when these sort of light and dark features of the novel come together. I don't think it's spoiling too much for me to say that Stephen's father's sexuality is what is undergirding this all here. And that a relationship or a connection to another professor in the department, Derek, will be something that exists on the periphery of young Stephen's mind and then sort of grows in its importance as he reflects on it as an adult. But here's this moment of that's described as a sort of like a self-disgrace. And, it's unclear what has happened. Has someone, has he been injured, or did, roughhousing go too far? But there's also that sense of a kind of crossing of line about desire. And, sexuality and desire really sit at the heart of the pathos and some of the darkness of the novel. And both father and son are submerged in different ways into desires that are breaking taboos and that confuse those around them. And I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about how desire moves in this novel and how it is not necessarily a sense of preference per se, but of a particular desire of a moment.
Yeah, and Stephen's father is very much driven by big desires, and some of those are sort of carnal desires, some of them are more abstract or intellectual desires, but he has a lot of passions, and these passions kind of take him in different directions and create different problems for him in his life in the past story. And certainly one of them, one of the major things is that he is, it's not a spoiler at all. It's indicated pretty early on that he's having a relationship, a secretive relationship with one of his male colleagues. And, because this is set in the 80s, this is something they very much, feel they have to keep hidden, aside from the fact that, Stephen's father is stepping outside of his marriage to have this relationship. And so Stephen catches glimpses of this and he kind of processes to some degree what is going on with his father and his colleague, Derek. And he has a very complicated relationship to that in the sense that, on the one hand, Derek is really lovely to him and very kind to him. And he likes Derek in a lot of ways. And we see a lot of moments of kindness that Derek shows towards Stephen. He introduces him, among other things, to Stevie Nicks, who becomes kind of a character of importance to Stephen. But aside from that, but in addition to that, he very much sees Derek as a threat to his parents' marriage, and he loves his mother dearly and he sees her suffering and he understands that his father's being unfaithful. And so reconciling those two feelings, I think, creates, a lot of kind of internal anguish for Stephen as he tries to, one, comprehend what's going on, and two, like, decide how he feels about it. And so I wanted that to be a strong element in the novel.
Hmm. Yeah, and this is a tangent, but I couldn't help but think that the Stevie Nicks aspect, which I loved, and I felt like Tusk and other albums are just sort of like beating in the background the whole time. They're the unofficial soundtrack. But I also just couldn't help but think about the kind of like torturous relationship between friends and lovers in Stevie Nicks's life, and how that was perhaps a kind of like microcosm for what was happening. Was that there at all?
Yeah, and there is actually a kind of brief conversation that Stephen has with Derek and his father when they're listening, to rumors, and
Mm.
he acknowledges that for him that album is a kind of inscrutable text, and just as his father in a way is this kind of inscrutable text about his
Mm.
father's life, and and I wanted there to be that kind of parallel that there, just as he kind of listens to rumors and gets little glimpses of what might be going on with the band, nothing is spelled out in a sort of crystal clear way. And that's very much like what he's observing in terms of, the adults in the story.
Yeah, no, I really appreciated that paralleling, and it was great. The other thing that I did, and this is yet another tangent, but I was so deeply into this novel when reading it, which these days I find is kind of a miracle because there's so much distraction that happens, not just with phones, but with every technological thing in our life tries to steal away that depth of submerging into a narrative. And I was very submerged in this narrative. But one of the things I did was listen to the soundtrack of A Single Man. Do you know that film?
Yeah, yeah.
Because there were elements that crossed over between that film and this book. And I found the soundtrack works incredibly well as a reading submerger.
Yeah, that's interesting. I love that movie, and I had not been thinking about it as I was writing the novel, but maybe on some subconscious level that some of those elements were creeping in. Also, that I'm thinking of the kind of mid-century modern California aesthetic of that film. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, no, and I felt they shared that aesthetic corner as well, although I don't think Stephen's family had quite the digs that he does in A Single Man. So Stephen's father suffers from an unnamed mental illness, perhaps a kind of manic depressiveness. His intellect and charm make him as often the life of a party and a font of knowledge and passion as they do producing these lows that are profound and difficult for everyone in his life. There's a period of mania that I remember really well in which he buys a VCR at the very kind of early moments of that technology and wants to introduce to Stephen to all of his favorite movies. But even in that moment, Stephen seems to understand that this is a temporary state and something that is inevitably followed by something less appealing. And I wonder what you thought of in crafting Stephen's father and trying to kind of gather up his incredible talent and his appeal with as well being a man of darkness and disorder, and also thinking about the toll that takes on a family.
Yeah, and so it was a tricky thing because, back in the early 80s, there wasn't the language that we have today to kind of assign to very specific disorders, or if there was, it wasn't commonly used in the way it is today. And so, I wanted to kind of show a character in the father who is sort of, manic depressive, and to kind of convey moments of mania where he is, to Stephen, very exciting and charming and fun, with moments of depression where these kind of darker moments that Stephen also observes without saying what this is. And for that to kind of only as the novel progresses become more evident to Stephen. And I was interested again because of the time period, just as there were stigmas around queerness. There were certainly stigmas connected to mental illness in a way that there aren't certainly as much today at all, but that this was something that was often seen as a sign of personal weakness. It was seen as something one had to keep hidden. And one of the great tragedies of the novel for me is the fact that the father clearly is suffering and he doesn't have a name for it. And he's not medicated. He's not going to therapy from what Stephen can observe. He's just privately trying to contend with something that's not his fault, And so I wanted that also to be kind of a strong element in the book.
Yeah, no, and his suffering is real, and the way that Stephen feels it and takes it on, I think is partially sort of carried over. I said in my introduction to the book that he feels as though there's a kind of like hereditary, maybe even like a curse or an inheritance of something, not necessarily that mental illness, but a kind of an unsolved suffering, which is partly what sends him out on this mission of reconstructing what exactly happened to his father in that particular moment in time. And do you think about that sort of like family inheritance as you're imagining what Stephen is going through with his own family?
Yeah, so it really is a story of two families. And, Stephen is kind of trying to understand the past as a way of healing so that he can be a better father to his son and a better husband to his wife, who he's separated from at the start of the novel. And so he's kind of doing that hard work in the way that his father did not. But I wanted him to be very aware of the fact that, there are elements of his father that he may well have inherited, and that, it's very much a kind of fear of his that he will kind of become his father, that he will that cycle. And so it is very much a story about trying to kind of put an end to this cycle of generational trauma and of, trying to kind of deal with whatever he may or may not have inherited from his father.
Does that feel like, I mean, we're of this, I think, the same generation. And does that feel to you the way that it does to me, that so many stories of our friends and relatives and things are about trying to not become one's father?
Yeah, you do see that a lot, and I think there is that that fear of, certainly of repeating elements of your own traumas as a child, as a parent, right? Of essentially becoming that parent. Um,
Yeah.
and so I think you do see that I do see that in a lot of novels. It may be a kind of Gen X thing, as you're saying. It's interesting.
Yeah. It just seems to be at the root of a lot of the the harder conversations that I have with good friends of mine, especially men who for whatever reason, in all degrees, small degrees and degrees as large as Stephen, are trying to sort out that what is inherited from those kinds of parenting, whether they're mistakes or just a kind of like mood of parenting, and what can be overcome. And it really, I mean, at one point, Stephen's wife asks him, what if you don't, find out what you want to find out? Are you going to be, what's going to happen for you? And I think for his present family, there's a lot of stakes attached to it.
Very much. Yeah. I mean, I think, and, I think that he recognizes that, this is something that he's kind of pushed under the rug throughout his life and throughout his marriage, but it's finally come to a head, and it's come to a point where his wife has said, we need to be apart until you figure out how to deal with this. And he realizes what's at stake, that his marriage is at stake, that being able to be in his son's life in the way that he wants to on a regular basis, that's at stake. And that's finally what sort of, makes him realize he needs to take this step. And so in that way, I wanted Stephen not to be tragic in the way that his father was, because he's self-aware enough to know that he needs to do this, right? And 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 so I wanted him to really be making a good faith effort to do the right thing.
Hmm. Stephen's primary relationship outside of his parents is his best friend Chow, child of Vietnamese immigrants to the US. Chow represents for a time a stability in his life, but also a window into desire and desire's after effects. How did you want to represent the profound meaningfulness that friendships take on in our preteen and teen years, and also the forms of support that they provide outside of our family units?
Yeah. You know, Chow is a character that I just kind of briefly referenced in that first chapter. I just kind of gave him a friend, and I had no idea that he was going to become such an important part of the novel. And I realized the reason that he did is because I wanted Stephen to have an escape from the adult world, because so much of his interactions are kind of observing adults doing things, right? And I wanted him to have a space to go to that was, as you said, a kind of safe space where he has a friend who is also dealing with some family issues, right? Who doesn't have a particularly good home life. And I wanted them to kind of find each other and form a bond through the fact that both of them are really kind of distressed by what's going on in their families. And so I wanted to give him that kind of happy space, so to speak. And a lot of those scenes with Chow are really very positive for that reason. And yeah, and I felt that depicting friendships at that age was really important. He's already an only child, so he doesn't have any siblings. So I just wanted to have some moments where he's interacting with someone his age and to kind of show how that's a really particular type of friendship, right? That's very different from friendships later in life. And there's something really just kind of very pure and uncomplicated about, a friend you have when you're 12 years old, a best friend.
Yeah, no, I loved the purity that you gave to it, and the fun and the excitement and the kind of nervousness and fear and anticipation of what this friendship is or might be. And and it does, as you say, it gives this escape, this way of being on the periphery of all the happenings in the adult life, and that's so important, whether your family life is fabulous or not.
Yeah, absolutely.
So before I let you go, Andrew, I'm wondering if you would share some things that you've been reading and loving recently.
Sure. I have recently read a really terrific memoir by a writer named Paul Lasicki called Songs So Wild and Blue. And this is just a beautiful memoir about his life, but it's also about his relationship to the music of Joni Mitchell. So one I really like as well. And he uses her music as a kind of metaphor for so many other things going on in his own life. And it's a really beautiful book and has a lovely cover. And I would highly recommend it. There's also a novel by a writer named Kirsten Sundberg Lundstrom called Alita that I read. And it's kind of it's a mystery set in the Pacific, a literary mystery sort of set in the Pacific Northwest, and a really beautifully written and compelling book as well. So those are the two that I've read. Yeah, I've read both of those recently and enjoyed them immensely. But once a book starts coming out, you have your free time to read disappears. So
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
I have a large stack on my bedstand of books.
So I bet. But those two sound great, and I haven't heard of either of them, and so I'm excited to dip in and take a look. I really love Joni Mitchell's music, and so I'll certainly check that out. And summer is a time for mysteries for me, so I'm excited about Alita. Andrew, I want to just say how much I loved this book and how much it really just captured my imagination, and I love your prose style, which I already knew I liked from the stories, and it carries over so beautifully into the longer novel lengths. And I just loved and admired Stephen and wanted to travel with him from his childhood and into his troubled but perhaps healing present. So thank you so much for coming on again to talk about this.
Thank you so much for reading, and thank you for those really kind words, Chris. They mean so much. And it's always, as I said, just such a delight to talk with you. So thank you for making time for that.
Of course. And I'll look forward to whatever you write next.
Wonderful.
Well, that's all from me for now. My thanks to Andrew Porter for coming on to talk about his latest novel, The Imagined Life. You can find links to purchase The Imagined Life and all of Andrew's recommended books at the website burnedbybooks.com. There you'll find all of our previous episodes, links to buy a podcast t-shirt, and ways to get in contact. As you listen, take a moment to rate the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, this has been Burned by Books.